I am super excited to share this one with you because I finally get to do a project that I've been wanting to do for well over a year now, and not only did this turn out to be one of my favorite projects I've ever done, but also ended up being one of the most expensive. As a woodworker, you might not be surprised to hear that I am obsessed with wood. I peruse the wood slab websites like most people peruse their favorite social media. And if you've never done this before, it's a lot like going through an exotic car website knowing you'll never be able to afford the ones you really want. Well, the other day I was on the Advantage Lumber website looking through their live edge slabs, and I came across this one. But when I looked at the price, I couldn't believe how amazing the slab was, and I think they priced it a little bit lower because of this crack that runs right down the center. But to be honest, I really like defects like this, and so I snatched this one up as soon as I saw it. This is a piece of monkey pod, and monkey pod grows in a few places around the world, but I'm pretty sure this one either came from Central or South America. And if you're just here because you want to know how expensive the slab was, it was just a bit over $1,000, which is more than I've ever spent for a slab, but is actually a pretty good deal for what this slab is. On one of the shorts I did recently about this desk, I got a barrage of comments of people telling me that I'm contributing to things like deforestation and how terrible of a person I am because I am told that no tropical wood is ever forested ethically. Believe it or not, I am very much against things like deforestation of the rainforest, and I actually bought this slab off of a website called woodslabs.com, and that site is run by a company called Advantage Lumber. One of the biggest reasons I like Advantage Lumber is because everything on their site is sustainably sourced and in no way contributes to things like deforestation. If you're interested in learning more about it, I will have some links down in the description, but just keep in mind, Advantage Lumber is a good, reputable company and is even certified by the FSC. But that being said, I know that a lot of you are still going to be very angry at me about this in the comments, and there's really not anything I'm going to be able to say to convince you anyway, so I do read all of the comments that come through my notifications, so feel free to have at it. Now, I think the reason I got such a good deal on this slab here is because of this large crack that's coming right down the middle. There are a number of different ways of dealing with a crack in the middle of a slab like this, and I know that this isn't exactly everyone's favorite solution, but I decided I'm going to fill this space with epoxy. I'm not personally interested in doing bow ties in the top surface of a piece like this, and unfortunately the crack was too wide to make this piece stable in any other way. I'm not opposed to doing something like bow ties on the bottom of a slab, but I figured in this situation it was just best to fill this with epoxy, and hopefully by the end of this video you'll see why I went this direction. A second ago you saw me slap some tape on the bottom of this slab and I called it good, but this turned out to be a really bad idea, and you'll see why in a second. I did eventually end up figuring out the right way to do this, but if you just put a piece of tape on the bottom of a slab, the epoxy is going to delaminate the tape and make a huge mess. If this was a large piece of walnut, the easiest way to fill this would have been to use something like solid black, but I didn't want to mess up these more brownish tones that this slab has. So instead, I added a bunch of this copper and gold pigment to the epoxy to give it more of an orangish color. I know the epoxy looks very sparkly here, but it's not going to end up looking like that by the end. All the tests that I did shows that as the epoxy cures, it blocks out most of the sparkliness of these pigments, so I really wasn't worried about it coming out too sparkly. I really didn't want the epoxy to be the focal point of this piece, and I didn't want anything too flashy, but I also didn't want to exactly match the grain, so I decided to find a color that was somewhere in the middle. So I'm going to be extremely honest and upfront about this because I haven't worked a ton with epoxy, so I didn't want you to look at this and think of this as a tutorial on how to fill a slab with epoxy, because I'm really just throwing things at the wall here and seeing what works. And spoiler alert, it didn't exactly go as planned. Even though this looked absolutely amazing after the first pour, this is when I realized that the tape, the way I applied it, was really not that great of a barrier, and I ended up having huge issues with the epoxy running all over my table and all over my floor. And of course I knew that there was a flaw right away, but I really didn't have any way of sealing it since the flaw was on the bottom of the slab, so there really was nothing I could do until I let the epoxy cure. About 24 hours after I poured the first bit of epoxy, my thought was that any places where the epoxy escaped through the tape must have also plugged the holes that it made, and so I could probably just keep filling this void with epoxy and it would probably be just fine. So I added another half layer of epoxy and I waited, and unfortunately this ran out as well. I ended up doing this process 4 times until that was actually true and the epoxy stopped seeping out from under the slab. Eventually there was enough epoxy in all of the holes that it did actually plug up all the holes and allowed a barrier to be formed so that I could fill the rest of the crack up with the rest of the epoxy. Once everything was finally cured, I could move the slab out of the way and see what kind of damage I did. I had completely destroyed the top of my assembly table, and so I decided to clean that up. I was eventually able to sand everything back down to bare wood, except for the opening where I throw my trash. Unfortunately, that doesn't open anymore. I'm not really sure what to do about that yet, but it's completely glued into the hole, so I guess for right now it's just a flat surface again. So if I remember right, the slab was a bit over 9 feet, and I ended up needing right around 28 inches or so to make the legs, and I went ahead and cut that off of the end of the table. And it turns out that the track system that I have doesn't exactly allow me to cut deep enough into the slab, so I had to cut a good portion of this by hand. It really doesn't matter how clean these lines are, because all of this is going to be cleaned up in the later steps anyway, so I was a little bit rough with it. The top of the desk only needs to be somewhere around 6 foot, and it doesn't matter exactly what the width is going to be, but anything around 6 feet works for me. One of the biggest challenges when working with a piece of wood is trying to figure out how to get it perfectly flat, and so a few months ago I had built this slab flattening jig so I could flatten any size wood that I want. Of course, doing it this way means it's going to take me all day to make sure these pieces are nice and flat, but it's also going to save me several $1,000s. When I made this flattening jig initially, I made a short video and put it up on all of my social medias, and I got a surprising number of complaints when I said that the #1 consideration when setting up a slab flattening jig like this is to make sure that everything is level in all directions. And I didn't realize how much of a controversy that one statement was going to create. Of course, you want to make sure that the slab is flat, and that a lot of people seem to think that that's the only consideration when trying to flatten something like this. But if you make sure that the table is level, and then when you put the jig on top of the table and you make sure the jig is level, and then check for level corner to corner as well, you can make sure that not only are you milling a flat surface, but that that new surface that you're milling is also parallel to the bottom side of your slab. And honestly, this is something that applies to every aspect of woodworking. There are always two considerations when making a cut of any kind. One is your reference edge, and the other is your cutting surface. If you don't account for both, you're going to end up cutting a side into a face that doesn't have any specific relation to any of your other sides. With the slab flattening jig, if I made sure that the top was being milled flat, but I didn't care about its relation to the surface underneath, I would end up milling a slight wedge shape into the slab, and the top and bottom planes would not be in parallel. So I'm going to reiterate that if you're going to be doing anything like this, you have to make sure that everything is perfectly level, and that is the easiest way to set something like this up. I was ecstatic when I saw how good this was starting to look. There are only a few flaws to speak of in the slab, but because the lines were so dark, I could just fill those with a black CA glue. And that's one of the benefits of working with wood with this much character. I ended up using both of my CA glues here, and if you've never used a black CA glue, I highly recommend this stuff. This is a Starbond black CA glue, and I'll be leaving a link in the description to the 2 CA glues I used, as well as the activator. And if you're ever going to be doing work like this, I highly recommend getting this stuff because it's great for quickly filling any of these imperfections, and at this point this can either be milled off or sanded off of the surface. Both of those methods seem to work just fine. One of the biggest struggles whenever you're doing woodworking is trying to design something that people haven't already seen 1,000 times, and on top of that, basically every idea in one way or another has already been done. So when I set out to design the legs for this desk, I went through a ton of different design ideas, and I tried to design them in a way that was unique, but also matched the rest of the build, because not only do these need to look good by themselves, but they need to add a ton of character to the desk as well. And so when I stumbled on this design, I knew immediately that this would be perfect for the desk. To be honest, I'm not 100% sure what the angle is between the vertical pieces, but I think it's about 10 degrees between each one, and that gives me about a 20-degree difference between the middle and the outside pieces. And then I have roughly the same angle on the middle inside piece. That way the angle on the outside matches the angle on the inside piece, just flipped. And then I could use the last few pieces of my home-milled walnut to make a bracket for the top and for the foot of the legs. It was a bit tricky figuring out exactly what angle to cut both sides of each of these vertical pieces at, so instead of actually doing the math and figuring it out, I decided to add the top bracket on now to the leg assembly. And this can just be pre-drilled and screwed into place, and then I can use that as a reference over on the table saw and cut the other side flush. Looking back now, I really wish I had made a second jig for cutting all these flush, but this ended up working okay. Once I had the design set for the legs, I didn't want to overshadow the leg design by going too fancy on the foot here, so I decided to go pretty basic with it. I built up the foot by taking 2 3/4-inch pieces of walnut and gluing them to either side of this larger walnut board and then routing a 1/2-inch roundover around the top edge. And I decided I wanted to do this as gently as possible by doing a number of smaller roundovers first and then gradually increasing the bit size so that I wouldn't have any tear out to worry about, but after the first few passes, I noticed that I was getting tear out anyway. So I ended up finding this starter pin and used that, and I couldn't believe the difference this made. It was sort of like using a good push stick for the first time. I had no idea how helpful a little pin like this was going to be, and it gives you so much more control over the piece and how it interacts with the router bit. What I ended up doing was doing a straight climb cut along the end grain corner with a conventional cut down the length. And when I got back to the end grain, I could do a roundover right up into the spot where I ended. And because of that initial climb cut, it gave me 0 tear out. I was ecstatic with how well this went. I have had this router table for about 8 years or so, and this is the first time I have ever used this starter pin with it, and I wish I had been using this the whole time. I decided to attach the foot to the vertical members the same way I did the top bracket. I just carefully lined up each of the vertical pieces, and then I could pre-drill and screw them into place. Part of the reason I decided to use screws and not dowels in the leg is because the screws ended up holding so firmly I'm really not worried about them coming loose over time, which was my original consideration. This also allows me the opportunity to take this apart when doing all of my finishing steps, and in the long run it's going to make everything way easier. And it probably would have been helpful for me to do this step before I attached everything together, but I needed to drill a hole in each of the corners of the top leg bracket so that I had a way of attaching the legs to the slab. But drilling the holes this way did end up working pretty well, and at this point the legs are basically done, so I can turn my attention to the drawer and the drawer box. One of the things I've gotten into over the last year is milling up and drying my own hardwoods, and if you remember back to any of my milling videos, I milled up a ton of this walnut and oak and then I dried it in my homemade solar kiln. Now, as it turns out, I learned a ton through that process, such as walnut is extremely easy to dry, but oak is the exact opposite. Unless you're air drying your oak, it's really easy to end up with tons of cracking and warping and a bunch of other problems I'm not even going to get into in this video. But since this oak has been acclimating in my shop for the last few months, it's finally hit its equilibrium moisture content, so I decided I wanted to try and use it for this project. I wanted to try and fill all of the cracks and defects in the wood with black epoxy, and this gave me a great opportunity to try a better method for creating a barrier on the bottom of the slabs. I decided to wrap a bunch of boards in this Tyvek tape and then just hot glued those boards down, and then I could run a bead of glue around the outer edge of the boards as well, giving me a perfect seal. And then I could go through and fill all of the defects with a black epoxy. I probably filled 50 or 60 individual cracks and defects, and honestly I like the look of this black epoxy better than any other color, so I think these parts turned out really cool. Unfortunately, most of these pieces ended up so thin they were basically unusable for the project. My original plan was to use this material plus the walnut to make the drawer and drawer box, but because I ended up with so much unusable material from this oak, I ended up using mostly red oak that I bought from the store and almost all of the walnut that I had left. And although it was a bit annoying to me that I had to abandon the idea of all these parts being made out of home-milled wood, I think it was the right decision in the long run. To make the drawers, I started out by laying out all of the walnut and oak to make the sides of the drawers, and of course this is when I got to use one of my new favorite tools for the very first time. This is my grandpa's old dovetailing jig, and believe it or not, this is 100% made by him many years ago, and even though it's very old now, it still produces an amazing result. All you have to do is clamp the tail side under the plexiglass and the pin side goes in the front and everything gets routed at the same time. It turns out that when he built this, he set it up so it's basically idiot-proof. The offsets aren't adjustable, so all you have to worry about is making sure that the pieces are flat and square and the router bit needs to be at the proper height. And at this point, I can just go to town routing everything out because this thing does a beautiful job all by itself. I don't know what it is about using old tools like this from family members, but every time I add something like this to my shop, somehow the process of woodworking always becomes so much more fulfilling. There's just something so amazing about using old tools passed down through the generations. It's sort of like being able to share these projects with Grandpa. I'm pretty sure my grandpa really doesn't remember who I am at this point, but the last time I talked to him, he was really happy that someone was still using his old tools, and to be honest, I probably wouldn't still be woodworking today if it wasn't for him giving me all those tools all those years ago. So I'm really thankful for that. To fit the bottom of the drawer, I routed out a groove into each of the drawer sides so it could accept a piece of red oak plywood. Then it was just about gluing all of the dovetails together and sliding the plywood in, gluing the last drawer side on. And because I know I'm going to be getting this question, I didn't put any glue into the groove that accepts the plywood because of how tight the fit was. I ended up getting the fit so perfect that I'm really not worried about it wiggling around too much, even if the wood moves a little throughout the years. And now that the drawers are to their final size, I decided to build the drawer box around the size of the drawers. I decided pretty early on that I wanted to put some pretty sturdy reinforcements into the drawer box, and since any of that movement in the slab could pull on the joints, I didn't want any visible hardware in there either, so I decided to put some dowels in each of the joints. It's always a trick figuring out how to bore a hole in the end of a board, and unless you have something like a horizontal boring machine or something like a Panta router, it's really not that easy to do. Since these pieces were small enough, I figured I could just clamp each of the boards into my tail vise and use my mobile drill press to drill a hole right into the end grain. And since I made sure to build this vise exactly square, I can use this as a reference to drill perfectly 90-degree holes into the end grain. The last thing I need to do before I can glue these together is to drill holes for the hardware. The bolts that I bought for the drawer box were a bit short, and I had to countersink the head of the bolt about a quarter of the way into the side of the board, but it's still holding itself to the table with a bit more than 3 inches of wood, so it really isn't a problem. And anytime you attach something to the bottom of the slab, you have to make sure to account for things like wood movement. Simply put, the different humidity levels in the air throughout the wet seasons and dry seasons are going to cause the slab to expand and contract along its width, so when I drill these holes, I need to make sure that they are drilled a bit oversized to account for that movement. If I didn't drill these oversized, then during the first wet season, the drawer box would basically try to rip itself apart, ruining the desk. Basically, the larger the slab is you're working with, the more of a tolerance you need in all of your hardware. Now all I needed to do was to stick dowels in all the holes and glue everything together. I used a wet cloth to thoroughly clean off all of the glue, even though this isn't something you're ever going to see. This is definitely something you don't want to skimp on though. If there's any glue left over in any of these cracks here, it's going to be a lot more visible once the finish is applied. So you definitely don't want to skip it. Bringing the drawer box and legs over the slab, I can now mark all the locations that need to be drilled into the slab for the threaded inserts. Once again, I decided to use my homemade mobile drill press for this because it's the only tool that I have that drills perfectly 90-degree holes in something this large. On one of the shorts I did recently, somebody asked me why I wouldn't just use a drill press for something like this, and I guess if you haven't worked with a drill press a lot, it might not be obvious to everyone, but if you look at a drill press, it has a very large post that the head sits on, which limits your capacity. The capacity of my drill press is only about 7 inches or so, which means I can drill a hole anywhere I want in something like a 14-inch circle, but anything larger than that would be impossible. So having something more mobile is necessary for doing a project like this. One of the things that was really important about this desk build that I knew I wanted to do from the beginning was to make all of these parts removable, and in my opinion, the easiest way to do this is to drill the holes in the bottom of the tabletop and put in these threaded inserts, which allow you to place bolts anywhere you want to, and you can bolt the drawer box and the legs and take them on and off as often as you need to. This also makes it a ton easier to move into whatever location it's going to be in, as well as making it a ton easier to break it down for shipping. I've noticed in the past that with these threaded inserts, if you don't countersink the top of the hole, once you place the insert in the hole and decide to take it out for any reason, it has a tendency to completely rip out the corner of the hole, so countersinking just helps the threaded insert go in a little bit easier, but it also removes any potential damage during this process. It also makes this look a lot cleaner once they're in. One of the things that always surprises me about most fine woodworkers is so many of them will spend so much time doing things like hand-cut dovetails, which sort of makes you think that they're more like purists, which is awesome, but when they get to doing things like installing the drawers, they almost always do the same thing. They take that nice hardwood look that they just created and they cover it up with something like a metal drawer glide, and to be completely honest, this has never made any sense to me because there's a bunch of ways of doing wooden drawer slides that in my opinion look 100 times better than any metal glide that you can attach. The only reason I can come up with for why you would want to use a metal slide over a wooden one is that the drawer can be pulled all of the way out without having to contort your hand under the frame of the drawer box, but if you really wanted to make a drawer full extension, all you would have to do is make the drawer slide a little bit longer than the drawer, and that basically accomplishes the same thing. In my situation, I just made the drawer slide the exact same length as the drawer itself because I really don't think it matters. I started using these playing cards a lot more in my woodworking because they make perfect shims for things like this. I placed a few of these under the drawer just before I installed the drawer slide, and now I can pull it all the way out and the cards just slide right out of the way and the drawer functions perfectly. One of the coolest things about using playing cards specifically is they have a very slick surface on them, which means they're not going to get stuck in any of those spots you put them in. Continuing the idea of a unique design, I knew I didn't want to cover up this beautiful walnut live edge drawer that I was making, and so instead of adding any hardware to the front, I decided I wanted to put the live edge section on the bottom so that you could see it, but I could also use that as the drawer pull. And I've gotten a little bit better over time making these live edge sections look natural, and it starts by removing the bark and then using this wire wheel to bring back some of that texture. And now that I have the texture where I want it, I want to knock that back down a little bit by sanding down the high spots with some 180 grit sandpaper, and this gives me the exact look that I'm going for these drawer fronts. Once I attach these drawer fronts, placing the live edge sections at the bottom does two things. It makes sure that the front of the desk will look nice and clean without any hardware on it, and it also makes the live edge functional to the desk. This is by far one of my favorite design elements of the desk, and I definitely want to do more of these in the future. These just get glued on the same way you would any other false front drawer. And now that everything is assembled and completed, I can finally start the sanding process, which means I get to take everything apart and then lay everything out so that I can put it back together later. Now I've decided that I'm going to expedite the sanding process just a bit for the video's sake, but just remember that if you're ever going to do a project like this, about a quarter of the time you spend doing the project is just going to be spent sanding. Building the project is one thing, but then making sure that you remove all of the tool marks and getting everything sanded evenly is what's going to make the project really shine by the end. Sanding all of these parts actually took me about 2 days, if you could believe that. I sanded all the way from 80 grit to get through all of the ridges from the milling step, and then I used 100, 120, 150, And then I could finish it up with a 180, and the slab alone took me about 8 hours just by itself, so when I finally started sanding all of the rest of the parts, I was just so tired I decided to call it a day and start it again the next day. And I probably still sanded for another 8 hours or so, because on day 2, once I got all the small parts sanded, I went back over to the slab and I realized I didn't actually get all of the scratches off from the first 80 grit, and so I ended up having to sand through all of those grits again so I could have a nice perfect top on the desk. Looking back, I am so happy that I did all of this extra work because of the payoff at the end. This is my first experience using Rubio Monocoat, and I can say just from the little use I've done, this finish is exactly what I've been looking for years. I've always enjoyed a really good oil and wax finish, and I've used a bunch of different kinds of oils in the past, but this finish is leagues above everything I've ever used, and it's probably going to be my go-to finish for a while. Unfortunately, the first 2 times I bought this finish, I bought it off of Amazon, and both times the only seller that I can even find on Amazon kept sending me the wrong product. And even though I do love doing Amazon affiliate links down in my description, in this case I can't in good conscience give you guys that link. So instead I'm going to give you the link that I know will actually send you the right product if you want to buy this. And that's the link to the Rubio Monocoat website itself. Believe it or not, you won't actually spend any more money buying it from the website itself. Unfortunately, with this link, I won't be getting any kickbacks, but I wanted to make sure that if you wanted to buy this on my recommendation, I wanted you guys going somewhere that is actually reputable and will get you the correct product. One of the reasons that this project took me so long is because I had to order this stuff 3 times just to get the right product. Whoever is shipping directly from the Rubio Monocoat website actually knows what they're doing, so definitely go there to buy your stuff. Also, because I know I've gotten this question a few times in the past, a single can of this 350 milliliter can basically cover a project this size with no finish left over by the end. Although with a project this size, I had just enough to finish the project, so you should consider buying 2 if you don't want to run out. Personally, I love the way this table turned out, especially because this is one of those projects that turned out exactly as cool as it was in my head when I first found the slab on the Advantage Lumber website. I thought it was so cool that throughout the entire process, I could actually see this thing coming together the way it looked in my head, which often isn't the case. This is one of those projects where it ended up being just as cool as I thought it would, but I also want to hear your opinion. Is this the type of project you want to see more of in the future, or is there anything else you think I should have done different in this build? I really want to get your opinion as well, because I definitely want to do more of these types of projects in the future. And if you stuck around this long, you may actually be interested in this type of furniture, so I'd like to invite you to go check out my new website, which is going to be linked in the description, where this desk and a few other projects are going to be listed as I build them. And if there are any custom projects you want, feel free to email me on there, and I would love to work with a few of you to make your very own piece of furniture. So if you have any ideas of something you'd like me to build, or if you want me to design something special for you, I would love to do more of this type of work. Thanks for watching!